Hello, my name is Daniel Rowe, and it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about unpacking bundling with you today. Bundling is an interesting thing, and lots to say about it. So I thought I'd just introduce myself first. I am a full-time open source contributor, which is pretty cool. I think I'm really privileged. One of the things that I do is lead the team maintaining Nuxt.com. I also am involved in some other projects, from Nitro, which is a framework for building server apps, to Magic Regex, Fontaine, First Commit, PageSpeed, and so on. You can find me on my website, row.dev, and there you should be able to find lots of ways of contacting me, from email to social media. I would be delighted if you have any questions, maybe coming out of this talk or something else. If you want to get in touch with me, that would be a real pleasure. I live in the UK, in Scotland. And this is my cat, Barley, and I'm standing right here where you can see. This is normally my view. She's normally at my feet, but she seems to have wandered off a little bit right now. She's a really lovely and affectionate cat, and basically I could talk about her all day. So I hope I won't bored you now or in the past by talking about her. But yes, this is where I normally am. So if you're dropping me a line on Discord or Blue Sky or something else, you can imagine me here. And I mentioned that I lead the team building Nuxt. If you haven't come across it, Nuxt is a framework built on Vue and Nitro. And it's progressive. So the idea is it should be able to be in charge for you. So when you start out, it should take care of making you productive as quickly as possible. As you need to take more control, it should give you full ability to customize your project. So Vue itself is a progressive library in the same kind of way, in that you can adopt it and gradually use more and more of its capabilities. So you could drop it into an existing static HTML page and then gradually start making it reactive with Vue. Now, it's similar, I guess, in a way with Nuxt, in that you should have best practice built in, but then you should be able to customize and make the choices that you need to make for your particular project. And so that's very much something that we aim for, the good developer experience, getting rid of friction. But I should say it's also not something that is always obvious up front. Oftentimes you have to encounter problems and discover what they are in order to solve them. And that is very much means that meta frameworks like Nuxt need to be a place of experimentation, trying to identify what the solutions are, what the problems that people are facing are, and then have an opportunity to experiment, and then have an opportunity to resolve those problems for people. Nuxt itself was created by Sebastian and Alexander Chopin a number of years ago. In fact, it was released, I believe, the day after Next.js. So the name was not an accident, one for React, the other for Vue. They've pursued different courses over the years. I became involved just in the run-up to version 3. I joined the core team about then, and I began leading it after the release of version 3 in January. And we're moving towards a release of version 4, which is a really exciting thing. My main aim with that release, I won't talk more about it today, but my main aim is that it should be almost a boring release. I want to, the release move from version 2 to version 3, you can see, took a number of years, and it was a pretty painful migration. And my aim is to show that we can have major versions in Nuxt. In fact, have them regularly without destroying people's lives. It should be possible to do that. So watch this space. Nuxt has a growing number of downloads and stars, which is lovely to see. I have got to say, it's always a bit dangerous to attach your own worth as an open source maintainer to metrics like this. I would much rather prefer to attach them to metrics like this, the number of people that I get the privilege of working with. So Nuxt has over 800 contributors fact, over 810 at last count. And this slide shows a few of them. Actually, I think only about 440 of them owing to GitHub API issues, but a few of the contributors to Nuxt. And I hope maybe some of you are watching tonight. Nuxt would not be what it is without the community that contributes to it and makes it possible. And that is truly something that is remarkable about it, and one of my greatest privileges in terms of doing open source work. You're not so much stuck in an ivory tower doing things as in a town square, working with other people, chatting, figuring out the best way to do it. You don't always know in advance, but we always come up with good solutions when we're working together. So I have a belief, and I hope that doesn't put me out of your good graces. But my belief is that JavaScript is good, or at least that it is useful. And while obviously, if you could build something without JavaScript, often we find that we need it actually to do good things, to make experiences interactive, to bring delight to our users, and at the same time, it's often overused. So I would consider myself a member of the anti-JavaScript JavaScript club, for example. In the same way as I also think you probably shouldn't use a server if you don't need it. You should try to get away with static HTML. And in general, don't use an advanced capability unless you have to. But if you do, frameworks like Nuxt should make it as easy as possible to optimize your setup and avoid people making mistakes that could be avoided. So I want to talk a little bit about the possibilities that meta frameworks like Nuxt bring to the table in terms of JavaScript and performance for websites. So when you think about what a bundler, we're talking about unpacking bundling, what a bundler might be able to do, often we think of this. We think of the script tag in your website, the bit that's the JavaScript. And historically speaking, this has been what bundlers interact with. That's produced by bundlers, perhaps if you're not just coding the HTML, the JavaScript you're going to run directly. But I want to expand our vision a little bit to the entirety of that HTML document, because with a meta framework like Nuxt, we actually control it all. We control the rendering of the entire document, not just the JavaScript bundle. And so when I'm talking about expanding our possibilities or looking a bit outside of the box, I want to consider and think a little bit about some of the things that Nuxt does that are not just in the script tag, but some of them are, of course. So here are some things that we're doing. And I also have some things that are maybe a little bit more experimental. But some things that we're doing, you'll of course know that that when you're rendering a document, you have CSS, you'll have HTML as well. And that CSS is going to control what the page looks like. And the process of rendering that layout is going to be one of the big things that's going to delay your page from displaying properly. So you can put all the CSS in your style, which is fine if it's just one file. But what often happens as you build bigger apps with components that are dynamically imported is that actually you have lots of chunks of CSS, and they all need to be imported in order to render the page, which can get a bit troublesome, particularly if you have lots and lots of these files and maybe only one or two lines of CSS in each one. To address that problem, we have worked on style inlining. Now, a Vue component, this is a Vue component, basically takes the component that you're rendering and creates a unique ID, which is in this case the file of that component. You can see it's pagesindex.vue. And actually, when this component is rendered on the server, we attach that ID to the context. So just before we're able to send the HTML back from the server to the client, we know every chunk, every file, every Vue component that has been rendered in that particular string of HTML, which means we can also then take the styles associated with that single file component, and actually inline those as well. So it looks a little bit like this. We iterate over the styles, we load them dynamically, and then we attach them in style blocks to the HTML. So we're able to actually create styles that are inline that don't require loading additional resources. The downside, of course, is those particular styles can't be cached, but we think the option for that initial load is probably more performant in most use cases. You can turn it off or customize how this works, but we think it's a good default for people. And so this kind of thing gets replaced with something like this, with a single inlined bit, which corresponds to the Vue components, and then still your entry CSS, anything that's global. This is going to be the default in Nuxt 4. You can already try it out with compatibility version 4, that we have only Vue component styles inlined, and everything else will be in a separate chunk. Oh, well, there's other things as well. It may not have escaped your notice, I hope, that there was a big change to the core Web Vitals last year, possibly, yeah, last year. And that change was the introduction of INP, interaction to next paint, as a metric. An interaction to next paint basically details the amount of time taken from a user input, like a click, until the browser has a chance to acknowledge that with a paint in the browser. You know, the button is now not depressed, or it is depressed, or it has a focus outline, or something like that. And when frameworks or users do a lot of work synchronously between the interaction and whatever happens next, it often can stop that acknowledgement of user input. We found that this was the case with static sites. Now, the weird thing is, so fully static sites, Nuxt has this feature called payload extraction, which is enabled by default if you're pre-rendering your website. And we take all of your API calls, anything that you've wrapped in a useFetch or useAsyncData hook, and we calculate it at build time, at pre-rendered time. And then we extract that into a payload with its own URL, so it's a JSON file that you can load. And that payload is going to make loading that page much faster, because the JSON can be preloaded. You don't have to make any of the API requests or anything else that might be costly. But we found that it was actually causing performance regressions, and users were reporting that INP, for some strange reason, was much higher on pages that were pre-rendered, even though the actual load time was much faster. And this seemed strange. And this, by the way, is what the JSON looks like. The JSON payloads are rich, so they're not just JSON. They don't just support strings and booleans and numbers. They actually support quite a lot of things, including view reactivity and more. You can even create your own. It's all powered by Rich Harris's dvalue library. So something like this gets turned into something like this, with every one of those items in the array either being hydrated into an object, an array, or some kind of rich object. In this case, we're actually hydrating components. Those individual items get hydrated into actual server components, which can be used and displayed on the page. So once we, in the process of exploring, we found a similar exploration from Malte Ubi, who is CTO of Vercel, and wrote a fantastic article on demystifying INP. And he suggests the use of a function a little bit like this one. This is what we ended up using in Nuxt, which is basically before actually processing navigation, we would give an opportunity for the browser to acknowledge user interaction. So we set a timeout so that it's guaranteed to happen. And then we request an animation frame, and then that gives a chance for the browser to do what it needs to do before then resolving this promise and proceeding with the navigation. The cost, something like 8 milliseconds. So it doesn't demonstrably slow users down. What it does is give a chance for the browser to respond to those users. So it's almost zero cost, and Nuxt is able to implement that for users so people don't have to do that. And they'll get the benefit to INP. It's not a hack, by the way. This improves user experience. Well, that was an interesting and counterintuitive thing, because what was happening was on a pre-rendered page, because nothing needed to be done, no async tasks were required, everything was immediately blocking the thread for re-rendering the new page. And this enabled us to create a more performant website for our users. Here's another. We released last year Nuxt fonts, and Nuxt fonts is addressed a number of problems that people were facing with performance. So one, font configuration doesn't really respond to usage. So you might use a font in your website, but optimizing it for performance isn't. You have to do that. Go ahead and do that manually. So if you inject that Google font tag in your HTML, you might still have performance issues you need to address. Stuff like your pre-connect to that third-party origin. You might also have font waterfalls where the browser doesn't know to download the font until the CSS is loaded, and also until the selector comes into view. There might be issues like that. And fonts, custom web fonts, can give a bad user experience. They can cause layout shift, and that's not great. So it looks a little bit, for example, like this. You might have some kind of layout shift as a web font loads. It's not ideal. So we were able to actually use some font metrics. They look a little bit like, they cause a result a little bit like this. The font metrics basically constrain your existing fallback font, your system font, into the shape and space of the web font that's going to load. And that can be done in just a few lines of CSS, and we can also automate it. So we end up doing something like this. Users pick a font they're using in the CSS. No other configuration is required. So we identify Oswald in this case. We then, using Unifont, which is a library I've developed, we grab the data on the font from one of the font CDNs that we support, like Google Fonts or Bunny or FontShare or FontSource. We download it, serve it locally from the project, so there's no third-party origin request. And we actually inject that into the user CSS. So again, you don't have to configure this yourself, it's just done for you. Then we inject the extra metrics. This is another library I've created called Fontaine, which basically just adds some percentage values to constrain the fallback font, Arial in this case, to the size of Oswald, which will enable the layout shift to be as minimal as possible. It can't totally get rid of it, but it can make it a lot better. And that's something then that users can use using Nuxt fonts out of the box, getting better font performance without needing to do that manually. Here, next one. This is an experimental feature that we're currently playing around with, but I hope to be able to bring it into use. So this is about chunking async refreshes. So I mentioned that when you pre-render a website, it runs all those API calls, async data calls, in advance. So it's not actually needed in production anymore. Or it might be used if you need to manually refresh it, like you have a preview API or you have some other logic that refreshes the data. But for most users, and definitely out of the box, it's not required. So why not take all of that function, that async function that might be called, and separate it into a different chunk? So we can do something like this. Looking at that async data call, this is how Vue will compile it into a function. So we can do a little bit more compilation. We can actually take that async data call and move it into a separate virtual chunk, which we can then dynamically import and call as required. That means that, and now in this case, it's just a fetch call. There's no real additional code. But actually, a lot of users might have a lot more stuff. They might be doing syntax highlighting. They might be parsing some data, or they might be doing something that's a lot more complex than that. And this can actually save a lot of space and performance. I tested this out on the Nuxt.com website. We were able to decrease total JavaScript loaded by 40% or 39%, and decrease unused JavaScript by 66%, which was a huge improvement for no cost at all, because again, no users are going to be refreshing the content of the website while they're browsing it. Another thing we've been doing, experimenting with, we again last year released Nuxt scripts. It comes with some built-in facade components, things like Google Tag Manager, YouTube, and more. And they significantly improve the performance of using each of those things. Again, that's something we're able to ship by built into Nuxt scripts, and they just immediately are better for users. It also features things like cookie consent, the ability to defer loading scripts until the site is interactive, handling pre-connect hints, works on the server and the client, and more. It's definitely worth checking out at scripts.nuxt.com. But one of the things I wanted to mention is the bundling functionality. So say you take some kind of script. If you pass the bundle true option, we are actually able to take the script, download it into your project, and again, serve it up from your first-party origin rather than a third-party one, which again improves performance in your users' project for your users. Okay, here's another also quite experimental one, and that is rebundling your website, also for static site generation. So you might find, again, if you're using lots of async components that are all imported in a different order, they're not all in a single chunk, you might find you have a website that looks a little bit like this. With all of these different script chunks, it increases the number of network requests the browser needs to make, runs the risk of hitting a sort of maximum, and that's not a great thing to do for the browser. So why not bundle all of them into a single chunk? Well, we were able to do exactly that, and basically create a single rebundled chunk, and then for every one of the existing chunks, create a data URI that points it to that rebundled chunk, and then wrap the whole thing in an import map to tell the browser where to access the exports from those chunks. So this means that you never need to reload any of those chunks that were loaded on the initial load. It will always point back to this rebundled file, and you basically get the benefit of only a single file downloaded for that initial page, which is pretty cool, if I do say so myself. And again, it significantly improves performance with no cost if you're doing it at pre-rendered time. And you can also do it dynamically at runtime, and the cost is also quite minimal because Rollup is a very, very small, it's very fast and it's very small, pure JavaScript. So, but that's not the kind of thing I would enable by default. But for generation, it has a zero downside. And so watch this space as we experiment with that. There's more stuff that we're doing. If you haven't come across E18E, it's definitely worth checking out. It's an amazing initiative to clean up and speed up the JavaScript ecosystem by removing things that we don't need, like polyfills for functionality, which is built into JavaScript now, and removing and cleaning up packages with lots of extraneous dependencies that aren't required. So we have an unplug-in purge polyfills, which actually works at build time to remove these polyfills to prevent them from being in your final built project. So that's another cool little project. And of course, it's worth saying that the best JavaScript is JavaScript you don't need. So Nuxt 3 has supported, actually since its release, the ability to turn off JavaScript using features no scripts. And you can actually do it on a per route basis by simply disabling script generation for that particular page, leaving the rest of your site interactive. Well, there's lots more to go, but we have a couple of modules lined up. So we have Nuxt Hints, which will aim to give you performance tips actually whilst you're developing. So we'll be able to identify things like opportunities to improve your largest contentful paint. And Nuxt Accessibility, which will actually enable you to see issues with the accessibility of your website as you're developing. It can't totally tell you everything about your website, but it can identify some errors and help you fix them as you go. But at the end of the day, the main thing that we want to do with Nuxt as a framework is enable experimentation. So finding what the opportunities are to improve performance, figuring out how we can use Nuxt and the end to end, so your code through to the finished HTML pipeline to make websites built with Nuxt the most performant they possibly can be. And if that's something that you'd like to help with, I'd love the additional hands or ideas, whatever you might have to offer. And if you'd like to play around and experiment with it, we try to release new features under an experimental namespace, so you can flip them on, test them out, see how it does for you, and then give feedback. That's incredibly helpful as we can figure out how to make Nuxt continue to be a great choice for our users. If you are interested, there's stuff you can check out at Nuxt.com. You can follow Nuxt on Blue Sky, or join a Discord on chat.nuxt.dev to discuss. Just want to say one more thing, which is that if you want, for whatever reason, to have a brief chat, a 10-minute chat, I have an open diary at row.dev/chat. Particularly if you want to get involved in open source, or you feel like maybe you're not sure if you'd be welcome or something like that, I would really love the opportunity to say hi and tell you you definitely would be. Whatever that is, if there's some kind of way I can help you, let me know. I'd love to have that call. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me today, and all the best.